Hello, everybody, and welcome to my Innistrad Midnight Hunt Limited set review. My name is Nicolai, and in this video, I'm going to be going through all of the commons in Innistrad Midnight Hunt and discussing not only what I think of the cards, but also how I came to those conclusions, so that even if you disagree with my ultimate decision on how good I think a card is, you'll at least understand where I'm coming from, so that can maybe help you when you're coming to a conclusion yourself. I think that the commons are the most important cards for Limited, so I'm going to be focusing on those today because, as you can see, there are over 100 cards to talk about with just commons. But if you would like to find my opinions on the uncommons, rares, and mythics, you can support my work on Patreon and gain access to my full card-by-card grade spreadsheet for Innistrad Midnight Hunt, my tier list, as it were, if you are interested in that sort of bonus resource. Before I get to the cards, though, I want to remind you, if you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up button, subscribe for more content. There's going to be a ton of Innistrad Midnight Hunt content coming out in the coming days. Both of those things are free to do. You can leave a comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. I love discussing cards, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. So, before I get to the actual cards, there is a grading scale. It's on the screen. It's basically an A through F scale. The A's are the best of the best. There are not going to be any A's in the commons, because if there were A's in the commons, it would be tremendously imbalanced. B's are pulls into a color. Those are the cards that actively make you want to draft a specific color. They just fit into a lot of decks. And generally, they're the cards that are very flexible. So if you draft them, you know they're going to make your deck and they're going to be great. C's are solid playables. Sometimes they only fit into a more niche strategy. Like, they can be a powerful card, but they don't go into every type of deck. And so they end up being a C. But a lot of the cards end up in the C range. And then the D's are filler. Those are the cards you don't really want to put in your deck, or they're more narrow. So there are some cards that are pretty good, but they end up being like in the D range because they only fit into like one of the 10 color combinations. And so you can't afford to really draft them early, because if you pick them early, there's a high likelihood that they won't end up making your deck. And that's just going to make things more difficult for you later on. F's are unplayable. There's also some cards that I give like a sideboard grade, which are essentially, if you are only playing best of one, those are unplayables, but a lot of the games do come down to sideboarding if you're playing best of three or if you're playing in paper. So sideboard cards are relevant. And then I give like pluses or minuses to give like some gradation within those grades. Before I get to the cards as well, I want to go over the mechanics in the set, because some of these mechanics will impact how I evaluate the cards. One of the mechanics that isn't technically like a named mechanic is the decay mechanic. And when a card has involves this mechanic, it basically creates some number of 2/2 zombie tokens that die once they attack and that are unable to block. So like after combat they die. So you can still like deal damage with them. But basically, decay as a mechanic is going to have an impact on how good certain types of cards are. So cards that care about you sacrificing creatures, you'll have more sacrifice fodder if you have decay in your deck. There are cards that there's just some stat line things. So if you are having a bunch of 2/2 zombies that can only attack, having all of a sudden a 2/3 is much more relevant, because those can block the decay tokens, whereas a 3/2 gets a little bit worse because a 3/2 cannot block a decay token, so your opponent gets to get through for an extra 2 damage. Because if each of those cards is just chipping in for an extra 2 damage, that's actually going to add up really quickly. So you want to make sure that if you are building a deck that wants to be able to go a little bit later, you have a way to block those decay tokens. And then there are some cards in the set that like let you tap multiple creatures, and so those zombies are able to tap to help trigger those cards. So those are just some of the relevant things to keep in mind with decay. Coven is a mechanic where you get a benefit of some kind if you have creatures that have different powers. You have to have 3 creatures that have different powers to enable your Coven cards. That's a little bit trickier to enable than it might seem in Limited. There are some things in the set that are going to make it easier. There's some 0-powered creatures that could help. They have like some nice spreading out within the cards, but Coven could potentially be tricky to enable, and it oftentimes is going to make games a little bit more difficult to navigate, because sometimes you just won't want to trade creatures in a situation where trading would normally be beneficial, and so that can sometimes like make it harder for you in those situations. So I think Coven's going to be a very interesting mechanic to evaluate on these cards. Disturb is essentially a way for you to get extra value out of your creatures when they die, or if they get put in the graveyard from other means, like self-mill, which is like when you put cards directly from your library into your graveyard, or you like, yeah, that's what mill is. But just basically, disturb lets you take a creature from your graveyard, pay its disturb cost, and like bring it back into play, which can be very powerful as like an extra late game engine. And then there is day or night, which is it's focused on if a card enters play, some cards will just say it becomes day, and then if a player doesn't cast a spell during their turn, it becomes night, and so for everybody it becomes night. And then certain cards will transform, and when those cards transform, there's sometimes benefits. A lot of cards are like werewolves, which are like a little bit weaker on the front, but then they become very powerful on the back, and so that's what day or night is. And then there's investigate and flashback, which are returning mechanics that investigate essentially generates clues, which you can sacrifice to draw a card, and then flashback is another returning mechanic where you can essentially cast a card normally, and then you can flash it back from your graveyard to cast it a second time. So those are the mechanics. One thing I do want to note about flashback and disturb in particular is it makes typical card draw a little bit worse. Like typical card advantage gets a lot worse when there are mechanics built into the set that give you 2-for-1. Similarly, if there's a card that just has investigate tacked onto it, when you have card advantage built into normal cards, a card that just says like draw 2 or make an opponent discard 2 gets a lot worse, because you don't actually care about just, you're going to be getting card advantage over the course of the game just normally by playing your deck, so you don't have to like put in a card specifically for card advantage. So that's one of the consequences of that. One of the consequences of day/night is that instants become more valuable in decks that want to trigger that and make it turn into nighttime, because you can still cast instants on your opponent's turn. That's just the way of the world in that one. So it's a very interesting dichotomy there with the way those work. So if instants go up in value a little bit, or cards with flash in that sort of situation. So we're going to be going through the cards now, starting off with Blessed Defiance. This card I did not think is particularly powerful, because not buffing toughness is actually a major cost. One use that I think would be interesting is with a decay token. So this is where knowing the mechanics up front is very important, because otherwise saying a decay token doesn't mean anything. But basically, if you use this with a decay token, or you can like attack with like multiple decay tokens, whichever one they block with their big creature, you buff that guy, and then when it dies, you even end up with a 1/1, which is nice. So I think it could have some merits there, but overall I think this card's just a D, or even worse than that, because you just can't really afford to play this. A lot of decks aren't even interested in the first place. Next is Candlegrove Witch. I think this card's like a C, because it's a little bit less, it doesn't like have inherent power until like the mid game, which your 2-drops kind of fall off there, and if you're a defensive deck, you don't even care about that power level. It's mostly like in an aggressive deck, this card's a little bit better than a C, and in a defensive deck, this card's a little bit worse than a C, but overall I gave it a C, because it's not going to have like a game warping effect on the game, and I just generally don't think that it's like insanely powerful, but it's still a really reasonable card. If you're in an aggressive deck, it's like a C+, so keep that in mind. But one of the reasons I gave it a lower grade is because defensive decks don't care about evasion as much, because they are more focused on blocking, and so a flyer blocks the exact same as a ground creature when you're on blocking duty, other than giving yourself options. And this doesn't even block as a flyer, so it doesn't even have that extra option. So basically, if you're an aggressive deck, it'll be a pretty good card, but if you're a defensive deck, it's not. So that means early in the draft, you can't necessarily take it as aggressively, like unless white is only an aggressive color, which sometimes it is mostly an aggressive color, which can factor in. So Candlegrove, which I gave it a C, but it definitely got some options there going forward, let's just say. Next up is Candletrap. This card is kind of the exact opposite of Candlegrove Witch, in that it's much better in a defensive deck, and white decks sometimes are defensive, sometimes are aggressive. So again, it's hard to take this early. If you're a defensive deck, it's like a C+. If you're an aggressive deck, it's like a C-, so I gave it a C as well. Again, you can't necessarily take it super early, but if you do end up with a couple copies in some of your decks, you're going to be pretty happy with it. Next up is Cathar Commando. I think it's interesting that white has both a 2/2 and a 3/1 at the 2-drop slot. I think that's going to be really helpful for enabling Coven. I think Cathar Commando is actually a very good card, in just because a 2-mana 3/1 does need some help, but then this just gets a bunch of bonus abilities, and being able to kill artifacts and enchantments is really nice, and giving it flash is nice as well. So I think this card's actually a C as well. I know that it might, like this card I feel like is maybe a pretty hyped card, because it kind of reminds me, at least my first thought was like, oh, Gustwalker. Gustwalker was a 2/2 that could gain flying. But I think this card's actually going to be a little bit of a sleeper relative to that, because the ability to kill artifacts and enchantments is pretty good. Celestis Sanctifier is next. Just relatively straightforward card. It's going to start like the day-night cycle, but the self-mill thing is not super relevant, especially in white. And so I think this card's like a C- or a D+ even. It's just 3-mana 3/2, as I said earlier, also doesn't line up well against the decay tokens. So keep that in mind as well when you're evaluating cards, but I'm just not a huge fan of the Celestis Sanctifier, so I give this like a D+. Clarion Cathars is next. This card is actually pretty nice, because it can enable your Coven very relatively easily. But I still, because it's a 4-drop, 4-drops are generally more replaceable than other cards, because you just can't afford to run as many expensive cards. And so I still gave this a C, even though this card does play well with Coven. And so I think it is going to play well in those decks. It's going to play well in defensive decks. It's a very good card, actually. It's just the problem is you can't just like stack up on 4-drops all that much. Though I would probably be, like, the thing is, I'd be pretty happy playing like 4 Clarion Cathars in a deck, I'm pretty sure. But end up with other 4-drops that you want to play. And there is another very good 4-drop in white, which makes this card a little bit worse as well. Next is Flare of Faith, just pretty much like a D level card. 2 mana for +2/+2 is just not a very good effect, and giving benefits to humans is nice, but it's not even that much of a bigger effect, so not a huge fan. Gavany Silversmith is the real deal, though. This card is very powerful. I think it's like a B- almost, which is kind of crazy. It's very similar to Basri's Acolyte from Core Set 2021, and just being able to spread out those counters, it could like grow your creatures. It can turn your 2/2s into 3/3s, so that, and then like, yeah, and just overall, if you have like a couple of like relevantly statted creatures, it makes them even more fearsome, and it can even just push through a bunch of damage to help if you get like some Coven enabled. Like maybe you can like put one counter onto one of your 2/2s and then put one counter onto something else so that you can like enable Coven. So there's some benefits there if you have a lot of creatures in play. And then it being a 2/3 is really nice because, as I said, with those decay tokens, it can hold them back. So you like play this, put counters on some creatures, attack with everything, and then this guy still holds back those decay tokens. Next up is Gavany Trapper. This card's interesting because it's kind of similar to Fanbearer from Amonkhet, but it doesn't have any power, which is actually a significant downside. Not having even a single power just makes it a decent amount worse, though generally you're using it for the tap effect. So I think this card is probably like still like a C, because the effect is like generally relatively good in the game. But and also having 0 power is kind of nice for Coven because there's not a lot of 0 powered things running around, so that can be pretty relevant. But I just want to caution against just thinking of this as this Fanbearer return, because not having any power does mean that it can't like chip in for a couple points of damage, which is pretty relevant. Like that first point of power does make a significant difference for a lot of cards. Next up is Hedgewitch's Mask. I think this card is just a D. It's very clunky. The like unable to be blocked is kind of nice, but they'll just have like a 3/3 and then they can block you, and you're like, oh. But generally they're going to be trading then, so I guess it's kind of nice for those, but just super expensive to use. Not a huge amount of benefit, so just gave it a D, but maybe it'll improve a little bit from there. Homestead Courage is next. Don't love this card, but it can be used to enable Coven stuff if you really need to. But I think the card overall just like a D-, because it's just sorcery speed effects like this. You can get blown out by removal, and it's just kind of tough to use. So give this like a D-. It's just, you don't really want to put that kind of card in your deck. Next is Lunarch Veteran. This is the first Disturb card that we have seen. But like a 1-mana 1/1 that can then pay 2 to get another 1/1. That's not like the worst. Like 3 mana for 2 1/1s is not the worst deal. If you want to see the back of the card, this is what it looks like. It's like you gain the life when things enter play, and then once you've played the back half, you gain life when things leave, when creatures you control leave play. And it's a flyer, so kind of like a cutesy effect there. Kind of reminds me of like Doomed Traveler, which was like a 1/1 that died into a 1/1 spirit. This one kind of dies into a 1/1 spirit, but you have to pay mana for it, and also you have to you can gain some life along the way. So it does have some benefits in that way, but overall it's a like not like super powerful because it's just a couple of 1/1s. So I think the card's like a D+. But if you really want to be a defensive deck, this card actually kind of could gain you some life and be a decent blocker if your opponent has like some 3/1s, or could be a good sideboard card in those situations. Next up is another Disturb card, 3 mana 2/3 Vigilance. That's actually a stat line that I'm pretty in for, because you can attack with it while also holding back their decay tokens, and I think that's actually very relevant. I think that that's a factor of the format that is worth keeping in mind, that because this is a 2/3, it can hold back Coven tokens. It wears counters pretty well if you can put those on it. But it doesn't really help Coven very well, because 2 power is going to be like probably the most common power that you're working with, so keep that in mind. But you also have this extra aspect of being able to get a flyer in the late game, which is quite nice. And so you have like a 3-mana card that can then play an overcosted flyer. You're generally not going to activate Disturb until you've already cast your other cards, but having that option is still tremendously powerful. I think this card's probably still a C. There's one of the like in a lot of sets, like this sort of card would be better than that, but because there's so much built-in card advantage to these cards, I think that in the context of the format, the fact that it's got Disturb on it doesn't necessarily add all that much. Maybe it goes up to a C+ in some decks, but I think that 3 mana 2/3 Vigilance isn't like the best card, even if it does line up well against decay. And then this thing is nice benefit, but that just like contributes to making the card like a playable good card. So I think it's just like a rock solid C. But I'm not like jumping over hoops to get it, because it's just 3 mana 2/3 Vigilance is very medium overall, even if it does line up potentially well. Next up is Ritual Guardian, a card I'm not a big fan of, because not only does its Coven benefit not provide it with a huge amount of value, but it's also that 3/2 stat line that doesn't hold things back very well. And I'm just not, I just don't think it's a particularly great card. I think it's probably like a D+. You'll sometimes play it, but it's not like a super like benefit or anything. Next is Search Party Captain. This card's very interesting because whenever something says draw a card on it, it just kind of immediately like draws the eye, as it were. No pun intended. But basically, Search Party Captain I think is also a C. Just kind of one of those cards that if you played this as a 4-mana 2/2 draw card, it would be kind of like underpowered. If you played this as a 3-mana 2/2 draw card, it would be kind of overpowered a lot of the time, or at least solidly powered. And so I think somewhere in between that range is generally where it's gonna be. And so it's gonna be a little bit hard to enable sometimes, but the body is relatively small, but it can replace itself, so that's kind of nice. But I think it's just a C. It's not like anything like too special. You're not like getting an overwhelming advantage or anything like that. Next up is Soul Guide Griff. An interesting card because there are a lot of graveyard shenanigans. So if you do nab something with this, it's pretty nice. And a 5-mana 3/4 flyer has historically been a relatively solid card. So I think this is like a C- because the exile part isn't always going to be relevant. It's kind of hard to set that up, and that's just 5-mana 3/4 flyer that exiles a card. I mean, 5-mana 3/4 flyer, I'd generally give that a C-, and the exile effect just kind of powers it up for the context of the format, which seems like a relatively powerful format. Sun Gold Barrage. A lot of cards like this like care about power, like destroying creatures with power 4 or greater. Toughness 4 or greater is a little bit more frequent. So for example, you can kill the Soul Guide Griff we just looked at, but you can't kill, like if it was power, you couldn't kill the Soul Guide Griff. And so there are some like decently statted toughness-wise creatures. So I think this card's a little bit more playable than Smite the Monstrous, which was just straight up unplayable most of the time. It also costs 3 instead of 4. And so I think this card's probably just like a D level card. It's kind of tough to use, so I'm not like a huge fan. But you're going to maybe find a target. It's just a little bit too inflexible to be super relevant. Thraben Exorcism, I think this card's just straight up sideboard card. Though there is the potential it becomes main deckable depending on how many creatures with Disturb there are. I mean, a lot of the creatures with Disturb are pretty good, so people are going to want to play them. I just don't know how frequently you'll run into those. And spirits or enchantments are also like, it's kind of hard to know how many of those you're going to see. Like there are some spirits, like this is a spirit, but there's also just a lot of like random humans and stuff like that. Like, and you really don't want to like, spirits like are on the back half of these Disturb cards, like this is a spirit, but you don't really want to be using this thing on the back half of it. You'd rather use it on the front half of it. Unruly Mob is next. This card's just straight up, I think it's like D+ or D level card. It's just kind of hard to use. You play it in the early game and it's like a 1/1, so it doesn't do anything, and then you play it like mid game and they just don't trade with your creatures, and they just, yeah, it makes it very tricky to use. So not like the biggest fan of Unruly Mob. It sometimes like takes over a game, which is kind of always like a fun time, but I don't think it's generally going to be super powerful. Next up is blue cards. So we've finished the white cards. Overall, when I was like grading these cards for my grade spreadsheet, I saw that in white there's a lot of C level cards, and there are a lot of cards that if you're in an aggressive deck they'll be a little better, or if you're in a defensive deck they'll be a little bit better. But generally there's not a like ton of cards that are just like, wow, this card is game breaking or things like that. Like I think the best white common based on my initial evaluations is probably the Silversmith, which does have an impact on how you grade a card like Clarion Cathars, because you can't have that many too many 4-drops in the deck. There are a couple of good like 2-drops in the Grove Witch and the Cathar Commander, so that could be good for an aggro deck. But then there's also a card like Candle Trap and like this Lunarch Veteran and like the Sun Gold Barrage. So there could be some nice support for a control deck as well. That's why one of the reasons why I'm not like, that's one of the reasons why I didn't give this card like a just straight up C+, because it looks like white can actually play a defensive role. It does have some cards that could potentially, like if you're playing certain color combinations, you could potentially enable that. You could even like use your morning patrols a little bit better in your defensive decks, things like that, and then win with a big flyer. So I think there are potential for white to be in more defensive decks as well, and do some more grindy stuff rather than just being all out aggro. So keep that in mind when you're like taking cards. So yeah, moving on to blue, we start off with Baithook Angler. There's just a nice Disturb card, 2/1 on the front, 1/2 flyer on the back. So it just like dives into a relevant card. And overall, I think that's just very effective. I think that's just a card that any blue deck is going to want. Your aggressive deck, your defensive deck. It's really cheap to use. So it's like if you run out of something to do, just putting a 1/2 flyer into play is pretty nice. And so I think this card's just either going to be a C or even a C+, probably a C+ level card, because it's pretty easy to use. And a 2-drop is that's relevant. It's pretty nice to have. but I could see it just being a C as well. I mean, one of the things I like about Bait Hook Angler is just any blue deck wants it, because the aggressive deck cares about having early drops that can then chip in later with flying, and the defensive decks care about getting 2 blockers. So I like that aspect of it. So I think that for that reason, it's probably a C+. I oftentimes, when I grade a card, I grade it on when I can take it in the draft to some degree, which I think is an interesting way of looking at cards. Maybe you approach cards differently. Some people approach card grading as in its best case scenario, whereas so gold cards don't really get a huge knock for some people. Whereas when I grade a gold card, like a card that's more than one color, I oftentimes knock it a decent amount, because it's like I don't like taking them early in the draft, and so I knock grade on. That's why I like explaining my thought process behind the grades rather than just slapping a grade on cards, because that way, even if you disagree, you can like at least contextualize it for your own grading. So you can be like, oh, I thought the card was much better, but I hadn't considered X, Y, or C, and so maybe the card's a little bit worse than I think. Or I don't think Nikolai considered X, Y, or C, so I think that the card's a little bit better than he thought, but his baselines still make sense to me. That sort of thing. So yeah. Next up is Component Collector. I don't like this card really at all. I think it's like a D level card generally. One of the risks of playing a card like this is that when the way that day-night works is once it becomes night for everybody. Once it becomes day, it becomes day for everybody. And so if you make it daytime and it later becomes nighttime, and you're playing against the wrong opponent who happens to have like some werewolf in their deck, their card enters play as the scarier side, like the night side of the werewolf, which can be very, very, very bad for you. And so playing a card like Component Collector in a color that doesn't have like terrifying werewolves to play seems very high risk to me, because if you play like a Component Collector and then like eventually it becomes nighttime just because you run out of stuff to do, and then your opponent like top decks one of their werewolves, they just maybe like get to play like a 4 mana 6/5 or things like that, or like some of the werewolves are even scarier at higher rarities. So it's like sets you up for a lot of risk for not a lot of benefit, and a 3 mana 1/4 is not good. So I think this card's like a D or a D, like, because like it's not like horrific stat line, but yikes, probably even a D-. And I don't think I'm going to play this card ever. Like, there's some cards that I give a grade where it's not technically unplayable, but I feel like I'm not going to play the card, and this is one of those cards where I don't think I'm going to be playing a lot of Component Collectors, because it's just not a very powerful card. So probably a D- level card. Next up is Consider. Just kind of an interesting cantrip design, honestly. You get to potentially mill a card. Like, if you ever mill a card that has some value, like if you put like a Bait Hook Angler into your graveyard, all of a sudden you got an extra 1/2 out of the deal, kind of like the access to it. So it's like almost like you drew another card, which is really powerful upside potential for a 1 mana spell. And so I think it's actually like, normally this type of effect is like a D, but there's also an instance and sorceries theme in this set. There's the graveyard theme, and I think that this card could, and also sometimes you're going to want to make it daytime again. So like, normally this card would be a D, but I think in this set it might actually be a C-, just because of all of the stuff. So like, you're actually like relatively happy playing this card, because not only can you double spell to make it flip back from night to day, you can like, because that's when the way it becomes nighttime is when nobody casts a spell, and the way the person whose turn it is doesn't cast a spell, and the way it becomes daytime is when whose turn it is casts 2 spells. And so if you have a card like Consider, it becomes much easier to cast 2 spells in a turn, and so that's a nice bit of upside as well. So combine that with the graveyard mechanics, like Flashback, Disturb, cards caring about things in the graveyard, and I think overall Consider kind of goes up to C- range, and the Instants and Sorceries theme, so kind of cool card there, kind of a C-, I think. Next up is Devious Cover-Up. This is another interesting design. It's a reprint from Guilds of Ravnica, where there was actually a deck where you could get like multiple Devious Cover-Ups and then loop them, because you could just shuffle back in your one Devious Cover-Up, get the next one, shuffle that back in. And so I think Devious Cover-Up could actually do that again. That's always an option. And so I think this card normally looks pretty clunky, but it could actually be a C- level card if that deck exists, which depending on how well the removal lines up, which color combinations you end up finding yourself. And Devious Cover-Up definitely seems like the shorter card that could kind of take over a game. So it looks kind of bad, but I'm going to give it a C-, and because another thing is, even if that was a deck, the card still wouldn't get a super high grade, because you can't like go into the, like, you can't take it early and say, oh, I'm drafting the Devious Cover-Up deck, because that would still be a narrower band of archetypes, because it's not like I don't think every blue deck would potentially be a Devious Cover-Up deck. It would more so be like, maybe blue-black can be a Devious Cover-Up deck because it has like the good controlling elements or things like that. So you'd have to keep that in mind, that it's still not a very flexible card. You can't really play it in an aggressive decks or assertive decks or even tempo-y decks. So still like a C- level card, even if that is a home for it. But I think that could definitely be an option. It'd be really cool if it was. Next is Drownyard Amalgam. Just 5 mana for a 3/6. the mill part doesn't really add too much benefit to the card. Sometimes you'll hit something with it. Could give you some incremental value, but a 5-mana 3/6 is just not the best. Being unable to be blocked isn't as scary. Like if it was a 6/3 and had that text, that would be really terrifying. But a 3/6 isn't attacking super effectively anyway, because chipping in for 3 with your 5-mana 3/6 isn't really what you play a 3/6 for. But probably still like a D level card. You could put this in your deck, it would be embarrassing. It has stats, it has an ability, it can mill you to trigger some stuff, but not like the biggest fan of this one. Next up is Falcon Abomination. This is a really interesting one. It kind of reminds me of like either like it kind of could be in some ways. If they can't block the 2/2 zombie creature token, this is actually the first card that says Decayed on it. It can't block when it attacks, sacrifices at end of combat. So if you wanted the official text on Decay, I think this is the first card we've read that actually has that official text. But basically, if the 2/2 can attack in, this is basically a Sky Knight Legionnaire, because it's like basically able to like get an extra 2 damage in compared to what it normally would have. So it's like 3-mana 2/2 haste flyer is Sky Knight Legionnaire. So that was kind of a comparison I came to in my head. If the 2/2 zombie can actually deal damage, it's obviously worse than that because it doesn't deal that 2 damage, but it isn't a gold card as well. A Sky Knight Legionnaire was a red-white card. But if the 2/2 zombie can't attack, this is like a 3-mana 2/2, which isn't the worst. If it can attack and get 3 for damage, it's like a Sky Knight Legionnaire because it like does it add extra 2 damage compared to what it normally would have. And then if you can use the 2/2 zombie in some way, if you can sacrifice it, if you can like make them trade with a creature for it. Overall, I think this card's pretty solid. Like it's like a C or C+ level card, depending on how well you use the zombie token. If you're more defensive deck that doesn't use the zombie token, you don't care about dealing that extra 2 damage some of the time. But those decks also aren't as interested in a 3-mana 2/2 flyer, because 3-mana 2/2 flyer is inherently more aggressive than defensive. Because if you want to block, you don't really care about a 2/2 flyer, because flyers don't block any better than normal creatures. Like that's just like a general theory. Like if you have a creature, if they attack you with a 2/2, your 2/2 flyer blocks the same as a 2/2 ground creature. Like sure, you could block their 1/1 spirit token or their 1/2 disturbed angler token. Not disturbed angler, it's bait hook angler and yeah, something drifter. But if you're blocking 2/2s, all 2/2s block essentially the same, and so you don't really care about this card in a defensive deck anyway. That's another reason why it might get a bit of a knock, is because you don't really care about flying in your defensive decks, and so if you are playing this sort of card, you kind of only really want it necessarily in your aggressive decks, and you want to be able to use that zombie. But if you are in an aggressive deck, this card's like a C+. It's like pretty terrifying. Like play this on turn 3, next turn you like attack. This is why if they don't have a 2/3, they can just like take a bunch of damage, because you just imagine going Falcon Abomination into Falcon Abomination. Opponent doesn't have a 2/3, and all of a sudden they just take an extra 4 damage, and you have flyers beating them down. That's just like pretty terrifying. So definitely like a good card. More so in an aggressive deck, but probably like a C+ in those decks, and a C just normally. The way I would take it in a draft is maybe like at a C level, because the defensive decks don't care about it as much. Next is Flip the Switch. This card is another interesting one, kind of like a counter spell, but in the late game it doesn't counter things, and it's also kind of sometimes it could be easy to see this coming. And also you don't necessarily want to pass with mana up, because their werewolves will flip or it'll become nighttime. So that's where Flip the Switch kind of doesn't necessarily fit. The 2/2 zombie token creature doesn't always really fit with a counterspell either, so that's kind of like a bit of a non-bow unless you have like sacrifice synergies. So I'm not a huge fan of this. I think it's like a D+ or D, depending on how well you use the zombie token, but probably like a D baseline. Next is Gale. Also, like you're basically holding up your mana, saying that, oh, I'll trade 3 mana for whatever they play. But oftentimes that'll be 3 mana anyway, and it's not even guaranteed. Like if they have an instant of their own, they just pass and do nothing, and you just burned your mana. So really tough card. I just don't really like it. It's like a D. Next is Gale Drifter. Pretty cool card. 4 mana 3/2 flyer. Doesn't need a ton of extra help. Adding Disturb certainly does help. It flips into a 2/2 flyer. Another benefit is if you mill this, you then have a 5 mana 2/2 flyer, which isn't the best card, but it is certainly a relevant card and something to keep in mind. So probably just a C level card here. Again, same thing with the Falcon Abomination, where if you don't care about flying, this card gets a little bit worse. But the fact that it does get to like come back later does make it a nice like control card as well. So I think it's probably just a C. 4-drops do take a bit of a hit in limited, just in general, because they're relatively. There's a lot of 4. There's like a similar number of 4-drops to other drops, but you just can't afford to play that many 4-drops. So I think this card's like a C, but pretty cool card. Again, one of the reasons why these Disturb cards aren't getting as high grades is because there's just so much value built into this set. Like there's Disturb, there's Flashback, there's like some cards that are just like card draw kind of things. There's like creatures that replace themselves. You don't really have to work that hard to get card advantage, and so Disturb doesn't necessarily mean you're just crushing your opponent in many ways. Next is Geist Wave. This is a pretty interesting take on a like bounce spell, because a lot of the time you'd bounce your own creature anyway in order to like protect it from removal, and this just makes that even better. And so I think this card, normally a bounce spell would be like a C minus, and this I think goes up to like a C level card because it's very flexible. You have a lot of options, and you can even like get a 2-for-1 out of it, like, which is really nice. Normally you'd be trading it 1-for-1 when you bounce your own creature, but if you bounce your own creature and it has a good ETB, or it was under a removal spell, or things like that, you can get a 2-for-1, which is really nice for this sort of card. Next is Larder Zombie. This is an example of a card that can be very powerful with the decay tokens that run around, but a lot of decks don't care about a 1/3 defender, and so I gave this like a D+, but in some decks it'll be better than that by a decent margin, because a 1/3 that can help you use your decay tokens is really nice in some decks. Next is Locked in the Cemetery. Again, kind of hard to use this sometimes. If you have some self-mill synergies, you can use this in your more aggressive decks, but generally it's more of a defensive card. I think it's probably like a C evaluation, and then if you are more defensive and you have some mill, it can be like a C+. But if you need to remove those blockers, it's a little bit worse than that. So I think I'd give it a C overall. But I think that getting to 5 or more creature cards in your graveyard might actually be easier than the Coven. So like if you're comparing this to the like Candlelight thing, I don't remember exactly what the card's called, but the white one that like gives the creature defender and makes it so it doesn't deal combat damage. That sort of card, I think Coven might actually be more difficult to enable than getting 5 cards in your graveyard, just because there is a decent amount of like self-mill and things like that. So Locked in the Cemetery is probably like a C level card, but it could go up to C+ in some decks. Next up is Organ Hoarder. I think this card is just fantastic. It's like kind of hard to sometimes to distinguish why this card would be good when the card like the 4-mana 2/2 in white that just drew you a card and can potentially cost less isn't a good card. But when I see this card, I kind of think this card just strikes me as very powerful, and I like to trust my instincts on that to some degree. Like 4-mana 3/2, you get to like get card selection, which is really good, and the other cards go into your graveyard, so it helps you like fuel your other cards. Like imagine you take a card and then you dump a card that has like flashback into your graveyard. You essentially almost drew like 2 cards or 1.5 cards or however much you view a flashback card as. And getting card selection is like insane on this sort of thing. Like very, very good card. The fact that you get card selection is just nutso on this card. So yeah, I think this card is fantastic. I gave this card like a B- because it is a 4-drop. If it was, yeah, because just being a 4-drop makes it so much like you do want to load up on these because they're super good, but you can't just play like infinite 4-drops, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately. If everyone just played a million 4-drops, maybe the game would just be not very fun. But yeah, very good. I think this card's like a B-. Very, very good card. As evidenced by the fact that most of these cards have been in the C range. A lot of cards like, well, this card's good in some decks, bad in some decks, it's a C. This getting into the B range is actually pretty good for a common. So B-, I think, for that one. Otherworldly Gaze, I gave this an F. I don't think it's actually unplayable, but I think it's unplayable in enough high enough percentage of decks that just calling it an F will just increase the win percentage of people overall. I could see some fringe scenario where you have a card that's like really good with flashback, or you have some like overall strategy where you just want to like mill yourself as much as possible to enable something, and you just play this card to mill yourself and like look for your bomb rare or whatever. But I think in most cases it's just an F, so don't play this card unless you're really experienced and you feel really confident that it's correct. Next is Revenge of the Drowned. I gave this card a C as well. A lot of C's, but I'm not sure how useful the decay token is going to be. If the decay token is more relevant than I think it is, like if it's more relevant, then like this card gets a little bit better. But I think overall just a C for this sort of effect. Historically, the sort of effect has been like a C or a little bit worse than that, and so getting that extra 2 maybe bumps it up a little bit. Next up is Secrets of the Key. I'm not a huge fan of this card. Again, as I was saying earlier, there's a lot of ways to get card advantage in the set, so you don't really need to rely on Secrets of the Key. And just this card only gets card advantage, and that's just not really where you want to be. But yeah, this is kind of a way to get some card advantage if your deck really needs it, but I don't think a lot of decks are going to necessarily need that. There's just so many ways to spend your mana with Disturb, Flashback on other cards that actually affect the game state. And so I don't think Secrets of the Key is super necessary. Next is Shipwreck Sifter. So I think it's like a D level card. Next is Shipwreck Sifters. This card's probably also like a D level card in many ways. Just you're not going to really want to necessarily discard your spirits. Sure, it's nice if it's like a 2-mana 2/3, so it's not like completely unplayable. But there's not like a ton of like looting in the set anyway. So not generally a huge fan of Shipwreck Sifters. Probably just a D level card. I think you'll play it sometimes if you have enough spirits or disturb cards. But generally, when you're looting, a lot of the time you don't want to discard your spells anyway, and so it's like not even good then. So maybe even a D minus could be just unplayable as well. I don't think it's one of the cards I don't think I'm going to play very much either. Next up is Startle. This card's like the exact same card as like Something Shock from the D&D set we just had, but this one just actually comes with a 2/2 decay zombie, which means that like whereas the Stagger Shock or whatever, it's not Stagger Shock. I forget what the card was called. I can remember the art, but it was the exact card without the zombie token. I think this card's probably like a C minus because that card was like a D, and getting a 2/2 zombie attached to it could actually be really nice because it literally doesn't cost any extra compared to that other card. The other card didn't get played very much, but that could also have been because blue was bad in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, so it's hard to say where that exactly lined up. But I think getting an extra 2/2 could really make a difference. So I think this card's like a D plus or a C minus, but could see some decent amount of play depending on how good the 2/2 is. And also early in the game, the 2/2 is more likely to like connect, so you can get that extra 2 damage in. But yeah, probably like a C minus level card. Next up is Storm Rider Spirit. Just we've seen this card before. I think it's like a D plus. Sometimes it can ambush a creature, but because it's a 3/3, that's harder to do. Maybe you'll be able to ambush their decay tokens. Overall, though, not a huge fan of the card. It's just a little bit expensive and hard to use. The final blue card, Unblinking Observer, is kind of a nice one. I think this card's like a C plus. 2-drops are just important and limited. A 2/1 for 2 is not unreasonable. And then this also can tap to help you ramp out your bigger cards or even pay disturb costs, which is nice. And that's just a decent amount of flexibility for a blue mana dork, which blue doesn't always get mana dorks. And so I think this is like a C plus level card. So blue actually has a couple of really good 2-drops this time around, I think, with this and this Angler. So blue getting some good 2-drops is nice. And then it has some nice evasions, got a little bit of removal, some interaction. And overall, blue looks like a pretty solid color this time around. Before I keep going with the limited set review, I want to remind you that if you want to find all of the cards in the set graded on an easy-to-view spreadsheet, you can find that on patreon.com/NicolaiBolas. I'm very grateful for all of my patrons, especially those at the credits level. It really does make a big difference, supporting my work, helping me continue to make these videos, and helping everybody improve at Limited. If you feel like my work's provided you with some value, check it out, patreon.com/NicolaiBolas. It's really easy to set up. It's flexible. You can cancel at any time. You can join back at any time. It's really a cool system, and I really do appreciate everyone who supports my work at Patreon. And without further ado, let's get back to the guide. Okay, dope. Let's dive back in with the black cards, starting things off with Arrogant Outlaw. Not my favorite card, probably a C minus. Just difficult to trigger that sort of effect consistently, especially if you're on the back foot or miss a 2-drop or things like that. So not a huge fan of it. And 3/2 again doesn't line up well with those decay tokens. Next is Bat Whisperer. 4 mana 4/2, not my favorite stat line. And getting a 1/1 is a little bit tricky. So again, I think this card's like a C minus. I generally like cards that do what they say they're going to do every time. And so I could see people that are like, well, if you get the 1/1, it's actually a pretty good rate, 5/3 of stats for 4 mana. But I'm just not a huge fan of that. That's not even the greatest stats anyway. And so I think it's like a C minus, and maybe even worse if you don't even have aggression going on in your deck. Probably like a D plus, and yeah, like D plus level card. Just 4 mana 4/2 is just really bad, and getting that 1/1 is kind of difficult sometimes. Blade Brand, just pretty classic C minus. You play it sometimes. It usually does good stuff. And some formats, there's like stuff that makes it a little bit better. Like if you have any pinging combos, like card that does like 1 damage, like when it attacks, Blade Brand can just take anything down, which is pretty nice. So it can go up if you have synergy, but just typical C minus. Blood Pact is next. This is the sort of card draw effect I was mentioning earlier, where it is a lot worse if you have just straight up card draw in a set where there's so much built-in card advantage. So I think this is like a D level card. Keep in mind you can target your opponent, so you can zap them if they get to 2 life, which is relevant. It comes up sometimes, but not a huge fan of the card. Next is Crawl from the Cellar, another very slow, clunky 2-for-1 that will sometimes have extra relevance with your zombies, but overall not going to be the best card. So I think this card's probably like a D as well. Defenestrate, fantastic card. I gave this card a B just because there's a lot of non-flyers. Most creatures don't have flying, and the flyers are generally the small ones that you can kill with your other removal spells. And so I think Defenestrate is going to be very, very powerful as just a catch-all removal spell. It's even fairly splashable if you have some mana fixing. And so Defenestrate is going to be a card you're pretty happy taking relatively early and then getting even splashing into other decks. So I think Defenestrate is very good and just is going to line up well. You just need removal spells in general. Next is Diagraph Horde. 5 mana 3/4 needs some help, but coming with 2 decay tokens is nice. And those things can do some extra damage. They can synergize with your other like sacrifice effects. If you have any of the cards that need you to tap 3 creatures, there are a couple of those. This can just fuel that all by itself. And I think overall pretty reasonable card. Probably like a C- or a D+, just because you don't need that many 5-drops. But it's a card that if you play it, it's not going to be embarrassing. It's like that 5 mana 3/6 in blue that mills you and can get unblockable. It's like a little bit better than that maybe, I think, but generally kind of a similar card. Next is Duress. Not really a main deckable card. You mostly just sideboard that sort of thing in Limited. So just mostly try to keep this out of your main deck because you just sometimes can't find a target, and when you do not find a target, you just kind of lose the game. Next is Eaten Alive. This card actually works really well with decay tokens. 1 mana removal spell if you have a random creature lying around, and there's a decent amount of decay, so there's a decent chance that you'll be able to have a creature lying around, and so then having a 1 mana removal spell is fantastic. So I think this card's like a C-level card just because the card on its baseline is a 5 mana removal spell, even if you don't have a creature lying around to sacrifice. But if you have any decay, the card gets so much better that I think that in a lot of decks it's going to perform like a C+, and you'll take it like a B- level, because if you have like 4 or 5 decay cards, you can just like reliably leave those cards lying around. You can just have like, okay, I have my 2/2 lying around, and then when I draw this, it's 1 mana removal spell, which is fantastic. So I think this card can perform really well in a lot of decks. There is also a steal effect in red where you can steal their creatures, and then if you have Eaten Alive, that's the cheapest way to sacrifice them at common. So steal their creature, sack it to Eaten Alive. Bob's your uncle, win the game, feels good. Eaten Alive, very good card. Maybe even a C+ just baseline because of the format context. I don't love doing that just because that misleads in some regard as to if you don't end up with the deck that it fits well in, it can be a little bit worse than that. But I feel like there's enough stuff going around that it's probably going to be like just a C+ in general. Next is Ecstatic Awakener. So 1 mana 1/1, but you can sack a creature, draw a card, transform it into a 4/4. So pretty nice card there. Works well with the decay tokens as well. Black gets a nice ways of interacting with those zombies that aren't just attacking with them. So if you have a lot of decay, playing a black deck is... I mean, I guess black does have a lot of decay anyway, and then blue kind of pairs with that nicely as well in some ways, because blue has some good decay stuff. But yeah, so sacking another creature, sacking like random cards that are under auras or decay tokens, and then you get a 4/4 and you draw a card, so that's pretty nice. I think this card's like a C. It's kind of, sometimes you won't have stuff to sacrifice to it, and you do have to pump that extra mana into it. But like a 4 mana 4/4 that sacked a creature and drew a card but entered play would be pretty reasonable, and this getting to spread it out is a little bit nicer as well. Next is Hobbling Zombie. I think this card's just good. See, I think it's like a C+. I think 3 mana 2/2 Death Touch is just inherently a good stat line. I've been very impressed by that stat line historically, and I think that this card is kind of just a good card. I think it could just be a C because the decay part might not be super relevant, but I do like the card a lot. So I think it's just a C probably, but 3 mana 2/2 Death Touches tend to overperform from my perspectives. But yeah. Next is Morcrit Behemoth. Another card that works well with decay. A 5 mana 7/6 menace is no joke if you can like sack a creature. And then a 7 mana 7/6 is kind of like unplayable. And so I think it's like a C if you have like enough stuff to sacrifice to it, because the fail case of casting for 7 mana is not the worst, but you generally would like to avoid that if possible. So yeah. Next card is No Way Out. It's Mind Rot, but with a decay token. So Mind Rot's usually a C-. I don't think the decay token bumps it up enough to make it like a higher grade necessarily, but still a C- level card. Or sometimes Mind Rot's like a D+, so I guess it does help a little bit. It's kind of straddles that border between D+ and C-, depending on the format. It does hurt that this format probably doesn't care as much about like raw card advantage, like making them discard 2 cards because of all that value I was talking about before, but still probably a C- or a D+ level card. Next is Novice Occultist. I'm not a huge fan of this card because your aggressive decks can't really attack well with it, so it's more of a defensive-only card or a sacrifice synergy card. Drawing a card and losing a life when it dies is pretty nice, so probably like a C- because of that lack of flexibility. But if you are a defensive deck that cares about blocking or you have to sacrifice synergies, it gets better. Next is Olivia's Midnight Ambush. I think this card's just a C. Then you can't reliably count on the night effect being in play, I think, for this one. But if it is nighttime, it happens to be like stellar. So if it's like sometimes you just kind of have to treat it on the front side because your early game removal, you're casting in the early game a lot of the time. But if you top deck it and it's nighttime, it's going to be really good. So probably a C, but it can do some stuff sometimes, especially if you get like cards like Shady Traveler in your deck, which we'll get to in a second. But like when you can have some control over it being nighttime, yourself, that can get a lot better. So it can get better over if you have certain deck, like certain werewolves in your deck. Rotten Reunion, I'm not a fan of. I think it's like a D- level card or a sideboard card. You don't just want to be making zombies, so you have to make sure that they have cards in their graveyard that you can actually like snipe to get value out of, like stopping their flashbacks and stuff. And so I think it's just a sideboard card mostly. Next is Shady Traveler. It's a black like werewolf, which is kind of interesting. I think usually red and green get the werewolves, but this one's nice, especially with the Midnight Ambush card. And then you get to like flip this into a 4/4 menace, which is pretty nice. So it's like a C level card because it's kind of hard to flip early in the game because you want to be casting your spells still, but getting a 4/4 menace is nice and good compensation for that 2/3 early game. Could even be better if you have like some of the midnight ambushes and stuff. Siege Zombie is a really good one. I like this card a lot. I think it's a C+. It works with decay tokens really well because all of a sudden you can start tapping your decay tokens to deal 1 damage to the opponent. And if you can get enough decay tokens lying around and then top deck a Siege Zombie and you just start doing 2 damage to them every turn with your decay tokens, then you can like attack them all in 1 turn to get even more damage, and when you're alpha striking the final turn, just does good work. And I think that even if there wasn't decay tokens, this card would still be a C because that effect is still nice for your creatures and you don't have to pay mana for it, and just gives you some nice little upside on your 2-drop. It could just be a C in a basic deck, but if there is enough decay stuff running around where you can start tapping those tokens to deal damage, that could be really nice. And just gives you some extra reach in your aggressive deck, so I like that as well. It's gonna like bait out a lot of removal spells, which is powerful for a 2-drop. And then finally, Vampire Interloper. I think this card's a C+. Like, it's very narrow, but it's very powerful in that deck. In the even though it is narrow, like a lot of black decks might be more grindy, but this is a very aggressive card. It works well with the red. There's some red cards that care about having dealt damage, and some black cards that care about having dealt damage. And overall, I think Vampire Interloper is just very, very powerful, and is one of those cards that, despite it being inflexible and fitting only one strategy, it just does that so well that it's like worth it. Like 2/1 flyers just attack so well in the early game, and so it's kind of like a way of almost always, like if you have like a couple of these in your deck, it's like almost always you're going to be on the front foot if you have one of these in your opening hand, because they just so hard to brick wall them early in the game. And there's not a ton of 1/1 spirits running around to like really punish this. So for those reasons, Vampire Interloper, pretty nice card. I think it's like a C+ level card, just really, really scary as an early game attacker. But yeah, I think Siege Zombie versus Interloper is actually an interesting like thought experiment, because Siege Zombie needs a little bit of extra help from decay and stuff, but it can also block. And so Siege Zombie is probably a little bit better, but I feel like Vampire Interloper might even have the edge still, just because like it attacks, so it's such a scary attacker. Even late in the game, a 2/1 flyer is still a very scary attacker. So I think Vampire Interloper might even be better than Siege Zombie. They're very close. If I had to pick one right now, I think I would probably lean towards the Siege Zombie just because it has that extra flexibility. But I don't think I would be super shocked if somebody took the Interloper. Okie doke. Moving on to red. I decided I like paused the recording to take a short break between the colors, and it always rejuvenates me. So I went through the black cards very quickly. That doesn't mean that I think the black cards are less interesting or anything, but I also think part of the reason I went through some of the other colors more slowly is because I was explaining a lot of the context while I was talking about the cards. So like talking about how they interact with night or day, or talking about how card draw is less valuable because of like all of the value built into cards. And so I think that kind of reflects itself where I can kind of go through these later colors a little bit faster, which is pretty nice overall, because it makes sure that the video stays relatively concise, which is what I hope for when I make these things. Relatively concise as opposed to an hour-long video or whatever it is, but still, I think it's still useful to talk about these things, and I know that a lot of people do value the longer form content, which is generally my audience. So I hope you folks are enjoying it. If you enjoyed this little mid-video rant, let me know in the comments down below. But yeah, moving on to the red cards. Starting off with Abandon the Post. Not really a card I'm ever going to play. It's like an F, I think. Just super narrow. It's sorcery. Like I guess this card doesn't matter if it's a sorcery, but like making only 2 creatures. If they have more than 2 creatures, they can still like chump block or whatever. It only works if you're very far ahead, or you really need to close. You're trying to close the game, and you would just rather have a big creature or something like that, or a combat trick. So this is like just an F or a D- or something like that. Next is Ardent Elementalist. I think this card's like a C level card. Pretty good effect. 4 mana 2/1's very small, but you get some nice built-in card advantage. There's a lot of card advantage in this set. But getting an instant or sorcery really works nicely. You get guaranteed a spell, so just pretty nice effect. In certain decks, it'll be like a C+, depending on how many good instants and sorceries you have. But yeah, next up is Brimstone Vandal. I'm not a huge fan of this. 3 mana, 2/3 menace is not the best rate, and those extra pings can add up, so it's not like the worst, but it's probably going to ping for like 1 or 2 if it sticks around for a while, and so it's like a C- level card. Moving on to the next 60. We're on the last home stretch here. Burn the Accursed. I like this card a lot. If this was a sorcery, it would be a lot worse, but because there are a decent number of werewolves in red, in particular, you can like pass the turn, have all your werewolves flip because it becomes nighttime, and then burn the Accursed on their turn, so that you still get to spend your mana. So I like that aspect of it, and so I'm going to give this a C. And that 2 damage to the face does add up over time, and so I think it's a C. And it could potentially even be better, because there was a card in Throne of Eldraine, Searing Barrage, that was like 5 mana, and it could deal 3 to the opponent. 5 mana, deal 5, and it could deal 3 to the opponent if you like spent 3 red to cast it. And that card was actually really good. And this card always does 2, which is kind of like a hedged version of that. And so I think that this card might actually be better than that card, and that card was very good. So this card could just be a straight up C+, because that extra 2 damage is like more relevant than you think. And instant speed is really nice as well. So yeah, could be quite good. But then again, like Faraday's Fireball in AFR wasn't particularly great. So I think this card's going to be a C because of the werewolf context. But yeah, I think the card's pretty solid. Next up is Electric Revelation. Probably just a D level card. I think pretty solid as in a C, but yeah. This card I think is just a D level, D plus maybe, D or D plus. Normally Tormented Voice is reasonable, but costing 3 is a big step, even if it is an instant speed effect. And having Flashback, still very clunky, very difficult to use. It does potentially trigger your Spells Matter cards if you are playing like a blue-red deck that cares about that. But overall, not a huge fan. I'm just going to give it a D. The next is Falcon Wrath Perforator. I think this card's like a C level card. It's potentially a C-, but there are cards that care about dealing damage to your opponent, so you could even just sacrifice this guy by like throwing it into an attack, knowing it's going to get blocked, and then just to trigger your cards. Not my favorite use of a card, but a 2/1 that attacks as a 3/1 is like okay, and then it can trigger your other stuff. It's probably closer to a C- in a lot of decks, but if you have the right deck, it could be a C. It's not the best 2-drop I've ever seen. Doesn't block very well. So yeah, probably a C- level card. Next is Famished Foragers. Not a huge fan of this one. If you don't have the ability to hit them, it's like a 4 mana 4/3, which is not great. If you do have the ability to hit them, a lot of the time it's hard to have a 3 mana spell to play afterwards as a follow-up. And even if you do have to use the discard a card, draw a card, it's like the same as the like Keldon card from Dominaria, which was a solid card but never too good. So I think this card's like a C-. And if you're super aggressive, or it's like a C maybe, but like the ability is just super expensive and clunky, so not like a huge asset on your team. So probably like a C-. I don't love, like, 4-drops need a pretty high bar to clear, and we've seen some that do clear that bar earlier, and this one is not really one of them. Next is Festival Crasher. I think I give this like a C-, but in some decks it's going to really, really perform. And so it's a C- more so because it's narrow than because it's not powerful. Because if you're hitting with like this for like 3 a turn, it's like crazy. And you can sometimes like double spell so that it hits for like 5. And kind of a scary card. Threat of Activation is real here as well. So I think this card's probably going to perform like, you take it like a C-, but in some decks it'll be like a C for your deck. Next is Harvest Tide Infiltrator. Pretty nice werewolf here. It's a 3/2 trample on the front, 4/4 trample on the back. It only costs 3 mana. So if your opponent is stumbling and can't cast a spell, you could just like win the game. Like if they miss their 3rd land drop and you've played this on the play, you'll just like win the game because it'll become nighttime and this will be terrifying. Yeah, I think this is just a C. Most of the werewolves, I think, generally, the ones that are earlier game don't actually get that much of an edge compared to the later game ones, because people generally don't miss spells until later in the game, and you don't want to like take a turn off early in the game. So like even though technically getting the +1/+2, most werewolves get like +1/+2 in stats when they flip, which is really nice. But and like generally like adds like a mana value worth the card. Like a 4 mana 4/4 trample would be really good generally, but you don't get that until later in the game. So even though you get like a mana discount, you have to wait a long time, and so the classic delayed value of the the classic would you rather have $1 today or $1 in a year situation comes up, where it's like, yeah, I'd rather have $1 today. So you have to wait on it. So it does have diminished, like the returns are lessened because it's in the future, but it's still like a nice card. So I think it's still like a C. And werewolves have some synergies and stuff like that. Immolation, definitely a fun card. The first time I read this, I thought it was +2/+2, as I'm sure many folks did. It gives +1/-2 as an enchantment in red. pretty interesting. It's like a Lash of Malice type effect that can stick around and make the card like permanently smaller, or buff one of your creatures if you really need to, or like finish the game. So I give this like a C plus. Just a nice like interactive spell for red, and I like that aspect of it. That's another reason that makes 3/2s a lot worse, but I think this card's good. Next is Lambholt Harrier. I like this card as well. I think this is like a C plus level card. Making so a creature can't block is actually a big game for your 2-drop in the late game, and so I think that's just a very nice effect. 2 mana 2/2 Wolf. Wolf can sometimes be relevant, and then making creatures unable to block is nice. Next up is Moonrager Slash. This might be the best common in the set. It's my current pick for best common in the set. I think this card's like a B plus level card, which is saying something for a common. But 3 mana, deal 3 to any target, so you can go face with this. And it also costs 2 less to cast it with Night. So this is like a card that you can like pass the turn, flip all of your werewolves, make it nighttime, and then you can cast this and other instants on their turn. So like you can do like multiple things, or you can activate abilities or things like that. And if it is nighttime just in general, it's Lightning Bolt, which is just kind of insane. And yeah, 3 mana deal 3 is already like a 3 mana deal 3 effect is already like a B minus or a B sometimes, depending on the context of the set. Deal 3 to any target, and then this just has that extra upside of being a Lightning Bolt at nighttime, which is pretty cool. So you are going to want to be careful, because you don't want to double spell accidentally and be like, wow, it only costs 1, I can cast my 5-drop and this on turn 6, because then your werewolves will flip and you'll be like sad. But definitely a powerful card. Being able to go face is a huge benefit with that one. Next is Mounted Dread Knight. I think this card's a C minus. 5 mana 5/4 trample, not the best. 5 mana 6/5 trample, pretty reasonable, pretty solid. And just 5, it pretty much just pays the 5-drop tax. Like, this is just a solid card. It's like but the fact that it's a 5-drop means you don't have to prioritize it as much at all. So yeah. Next is Neonate's Rush. I think this card's like a C minus, but if you have a decent amount of vampires, it can be like a C. Dealing 1, there are some 1 toughness creatures, or you can like finish off a creature in combat. The fact that this replaces itself by drawing a card is nice as well. So like pinging them, drawing a card, finishing off a creature in combat, all those are relevant things to do. But yeah, probably like a C minus card that can be a C if you have enough vampires, or it's like a D plus card that can be a C minus if you have enough vampires. Probably the latter, because unless there's not that many 1 toughness creatures running around. There's some for sure, so probably like a C minus in a lot of decks if you have some vampires. Next is Pax Betrayal. This is the steal effect. You don't really want to play this unless you have some sacrifice effects as well. The fact that it can scry you 2 if you have a wolf or werewolf is nice, because scry 2 is almost the equivalent of draw a card in the late game. So if you have enough of those, you could potentially play this as a finisher for your deck as well. And overall, I'm like thinking, I got distracted reading the flavor text of this card. Tovolah's Howl of Command was too much to resist, even for Arlen's own loyal pack. Yeah, so much for loyalty. That's why she's so depressed. Wow, Pax Betrayal. The flavor lines up with the flavor text. The card tag. Wow, who would have known? That's pretty cool. But yeah, this card's generally like a C minus in a lot of cases, because you can't actually take it super early because it's such a narrow card, but it's very powerful when it works out. Just remember Price of Loyalty from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. And as I mentioned, there's that black card that can like sack a creature to kill a creature, which is a really good pairing with this. So it's mostly good in black-red, so it gets the major penalty for only being good in 1 color combination, even though it is technically playable outside of that. And then, yeah, just kind of tough card to use in general. But I think it's like you'll take it like a C minus, and in some decks it'll play like a C plus, or even better. Next is Raise the Effigy. I think this card's just a D. Sometimes there'll be artifacts you need to kill. Sometimes you'll care about the attacking creature part. A lot of the time, you won't play this because your deck doesn't care about attacking at all. So it's like a D minus in decks that don't care about attacking. And then sometimes +2/+2 to an attacker is just what you need. And sometimes the artifact part is relevant. Next up is Stolen Vitality. Again, this card's like a D. You don't really want to use combat tricks on defense because it's such a high blowout potential. So the second half of this card is not something I'm super optimistic for. And the +3/+1 and trample part is not great either. And so I give that card a D. Like the +3 first strike part is not like irrelevant. That's why the card's like not a D minus, but yeah, +3/+1, brute strength or whatever the card is called. And trample is like not a good card generally. Next up is Tavern Ruffian. This is a interesting werewolf. This one actually gets +4 worth of stats if it flips, and it becomes a 6/5, which is absolutely terrifying. So if your opponent stumbles, you can just like take over with this. If you have like a way to pass your turn and then flip it, make it become night, like making a 4 mana 6/5 is no joke. Or if it's already nighttime somehow. But pretty scary card overall, and I think it's just a C, but it could definitely perform well in your deck if you build around it a little bit. Again, 4-mana plays have some inherent downside associated with them, but the fact that this is a 6/5 in the late game a lot of the time means that you're going to be able to get some nice worth out of it. You can also potentially have synergies with werewolves. And overall, it's like a C, sometimes it'll be a C minus, but I think it's harder to go lower than that just because the upside potential is really there. And in the late game, it's going to be pretty easy to have this just to be a 6/5. So I think it's just going to be a C level card. I'm pretty excited to try out the werewolves. I really think the werewolf mechanic is a fun one. It's an interesting puzzle. And then the final red card is Voldaren Stinger. I think this card's a D minus probably, or D. You only want it in aggressive decks, which is immediately a knock against it. It needs some mana. You need to have like mana to be able to like threaten the activation, and hitting them for 1 every turn is just not worth it. Even if they can like technically just take 1 and it'll trigger your cards. So I think it's like a D minus, not a card I'm super excited to play. Moving on to green, it's the last color before getting to some colorless cards. Pretty exciting stuff so far. Bird Admirer is the first one. I kind of like this card. It's more of a defensive werewolf. It flips into a 3/5 reach. It's a 1/4 reach on its baseline. And so if you have some instance of your own, this is the sort of card where I think generally you don't want your deck that is defensive to be making it nighttime because then their werewolves are scarier. But in certain matchups you would because they don't have werewolves. And so you'll just play this, then you'll hold up an instant. It'll flip. You'll play your instant on their turn, and all of a sudden you just have a 3/5 that's just impossible to get through. So pretty nice effect there. So I like Bird Admirer at a C level card because some decks don't really care about a 1/4. Bounding Wolf. Normally this card would be like a C minus, but because of the presence of werewolves, I give it a C because it's a great card to hold up, flip your werewolves, and then cast this on their turn so you don't fall behind on board. So kind of nice effect in this set. Next is Bramble Armor, just a D. This is not a very good card. The equip is too much. +2/+1 is not worth it. And yeah, not a huge fan. Candlelit Cavalry, giving this a C minus. 5-mana 5/5 is pretty much a C minus. Giving it trample sometimes is nice as well. It's a little bit easier to enable Coven on this because you'll generally have like a 2-power creature and a 3-power creature, maybe by the time it's turn 5, but you also might have traded creatures, so hard to say for sure, but just pretty much replaceable 5-drop, which gets me like a C minus level grade. There's like yeah, it's just not a card I'm super excited to play. Dawnheart Rejuvenator. If you're splashing, this card's good. If you're not splashing, this card gets a lot worse. Sometimes you'll like need a defensive body that can ramp you up. There's not like a ton of just random top end cards though. A lot of the big cards are werewolves, and the werewolves are relatively cheap, so you don't need to ramp as much. There are some flashback costs, which is relevant, so you'll have ways to spend your mana the whole game. So this card can do stuff, but generally tapping your 2/4 to get mana is a little bit tough stat-wise because then you don't have enough for blocking. So it's like a C or C minus level card. Probably a C in general. The 3 life is nice as well. It does some good stuff. It fixes your mana. So I think it's like a C, but a lot of decks won't want it because they're more aggressive or things like that. So because of the inflexibility, I could also see it being a C minus. If I had to give a final grade on it, I'd probably say C minus just because if you're aggressive, you don't want a 4-mana 2/4. But if you're defensive, it'll be a C. Next is Duel for Dominance. This card is just hard to use. It's kind of difficult because it's going to be hard to flip have big creatures sometimes because you need your werewolves to flip, and it's just a fight spell. Getting Coven is nice because then it's a 2-mana hunt the week, so I think it's still like a C level card, but it's hard to go like super high up with fight effects in general because it's so easy to blow them out these days. And blue has like a bounce spell, and blue has 2 bounce spells that are actually pretty playable, so makes it hard to play against blue decks. Red has like the really cheap burn spell if it's nighttime. It just makes it really tough to use. Next is so I think it's a C. Next is Eccentric Farmer. I think this card's a C as well. Again, the inbuilt card advantage from this thing, where you mill 3 cards and then get a land, is nice. But there's so much card advantage built into this set that I don't think it pushes it into a C+ range level card, especially because you don't really care about this in your aggressive decks as much. So yeah, if you're a graveyard deck, this card's definitely a C+ because you mill 3, which is worth some percentage of a card, and you get a land, so you can keep like building up your mana to cast your flashback stuff. But if you're an aggressive deck, you don't really care about that aspect of it. So I think it's a C. But again, a lot of the C's are like C+ in some decks, C- in others. But like where you take it in the draft is very contextual. But yeah, I think that's why I like talking about the cards a lot of the time as well. But yeah, Harvesttide Sentry's next. Again, it's just pretty much like a C. You just need 2 drops and limited, and this one's reasonable. 2-mana 3/1 does need some help, but the Coven ability is actually somewhat relevant. Makes it less likely to get like trade like with a random 1/1 or something. There are some things that punish 1 toughness, but That's the price you pay for dealing 3 damage sometimes, 3 times in the early game, a couple times in the early game. So yeah, Harvest Sentry, I'm going to give that a C. Howl of the Hunt, really kind of a scary card. I think if you're in any way interested in attacking and stuff, Howl of the Hunt is terrifying. Like being able to attack with your wolf, then ambush them with this card is nice. Or they block and you buff up your guy. Like that's the general way. You attack your 2/2 into their 2/2, and then you just win the game by playing Howl of the Hunt. And for that reason, I think this card's like a C. It's just devastating to play with and against. And the fact that you can untap your creature is nice as well. It is fair. You can sometimes play around this sort of card, but if you ever get wrecked by it, you just lose. And so over time, it'll probably settle maybe at C- because you can't just like jam 6 of these in the deck, especially because in best of 3, they'll start playing around it. But definitely a scary card. So probably a C- level card, but really good in the aggressive decks. Might of the Old Ways, another good card for the aggressive decks. Similar to Howl of the Hunt, when it sticks around, you'll get a nice little bit of advantage and kind of replace itself. So I think it's also like a C- level card, a little bit cheaper than Howl, but the fact that they're both in the set means it'll be easier to play around them because they can both give +2/+2. Next is Path to the Festival. I think this card's a C- because some decks don't care about ramping, but if you do care about ramping up and fixing your mana, this card is actually going to be really good because you can even flash it back, get even more mana. You can even double splash thanks to it. So Path to the Festival and Eccentric Farmer could be best friends. Eccentric Farmer, mill Path to the Festival, get a land, play Path to the Festival, get another land. Cool stuff. The Scry one is also nice as well, so you don't draw too many lands in the late game. I think it's like a C-, but in certain decks it's a C. Or even better, eventually. Next is Pestilent Wolf. I give this card a C+. I think this card's really good. It's a 2-drop that can always attack because there's always at least the threat of a trade. And that's just really valuable. And it also plays defense decently well in the late game. And it's a wolf. And 2-drop, it can attack, block. It could just be closer to a C, but it's similar to how the red 2-drop wolf I gave a C+ because it could remove blockers. I just like this sort of effect on my 2-drops. Next is Plummet. It's just a straight up sideboard card, similar to Return to Nature, also a sideboard card, though in certain contexts I could see this being main deckable, just depending on the artifact and enchantment. Generally, getting rid of a card from a graveyard isn't worth a full card, so you don't want to do that, but I could see it being relevant enough with enough artifacts and enchantments around. Next is Shadow Beast Sighting. As I said, 4-drops do have a premium. They do have to be quite good to be worth like a lot of benefit, but I think this one is. I think this is a C+ level card. Could be even a little bit better than that. Probably not because it's super expensive to use, but making a 4/4 and then being able to flash it back and get another 4/4. 4/4 is a very relevant body size, and so I think this card's quite good. And probably a C+. It could even go into the B- range, which is kind of crazy for an expensive creature essentially, but yeah, it really does a lot of work. It doesn't do well against the bounce spells, but I think this card's quite nice. And it also works well with Self-Mill, so probably a C+ level card. Next is Snarling Wolf. This is just a D. You only can play it in aggressive decks, and even then it's hard to use. Tapping at the window, not a huge fan of this either. Getting a creature is not necessarily guaranteed, even when you look at the top 3, and so spending 2 mana and doing nothing would be really bad, even if you are filling your graveyard. So for that reason, I think this card's like a D-. I'm not super excited about it. Timberland Guide, just a straight up C or C-. A lot of the time it plays like a C-, but having 2-drops is really valuable, so you can treat it like a C if you are in an aggressive deck, but probably like a C- overall. Next is Tireless Hauler. It's like a C-. Most werewolves, like the later game in the game you play the werewolf, the less terrifying it is as like potential flip target, but it flips into a 6/6 vigilance, which is still relatively scary. So probably like a C- level card. Again, you don't need to prioritize 5-drops. A lot of these 5-drops are very replaceable with each other. There's another 5/5 in green that's like the one that can gain trample with Covenant. Or Coven. I don't know why I keep saying Covenant. I guess because it's a similar word. But yeah, the Coven one that can be a 5/5 trample, just similar role to this. So you don't really need either of them. So maybe they're both just a D+, because whichever one your deck needs, you can get one of them. Moving on to the last few cards, the colorless cards. Crossroads Candle Guide, probably just a D. It's 4 mana 3/4 is not the best body. The effect is not super relevant, and overall you're not super thrilled to play this card. But it's reasonable. Like if you play this card, it's not going to be embarrassing. Jack-o'-lantern, probably like a D+, because in a certain deck, like a defensive deck, because you can like get like almost a 1.5 for one if you can get rid of a disturb card or a flashback card or something like that. And then the extra mana fixing could be nice as well if you are splashing. So I think that for that reason, it could be like a D+. It's like almost like a one-shot Prophetic Prism type deal, like a Chromatic Star type card. Like it replaces itself, and then you can like filter your mana through it, which is nice. So I think it could be a D+. It could be like a really interesting card in the format because it looks really bad kind of on its face value. I don't know why, but like I saw it, I was like, wow, like, because usually these cheap artifacts that are kind of random and don't have a bunch of minor effects aren't very good. But this one actually seems like it could have some potential. Like if you're trying to splash one card and you have a jack-o'-lantern, you can kind of treat that as a colored source for it, because it's kind of hard to interact with once it's in the graveyard and stuff. Even if it's in play, you just sacrifice it if they try to target it. So pretty nice card there, I'd say, for splashing even. So probably like a D+. I think it's a very interesting card. Silver Bolt, actually a very good card. I think this is a C+, which is kind of saying something, but being able to snipe a werewolf is really good, because keep in mind the werewolves are still werewolves on their front side, so you can just kill a Tyler's Hauler for 3 mana. As I said, 3 mana, deal 3 to, like, not any target with this one, but to a creature is pretty nice. And so that, like, if you had 3 mana, deal 3 to a creature, that would be like a C+ anyway, or a C anyway. And the fact that this is colorless is really nice. This could even go up to B- level territory, because it's so flexible. You can take it early in the draft and then snipe the werewolves. So I'm really excited to play with this card. I think it's still a C+. It doesn't quite go up to B- or anything, but definitely a very powerful card, and one that I'm really excited to try out. Then finally, Stuffed Bear. Not a super good card, just like a D-, or maybe probably just a straight up F. To be quite honest, you don't really ever want this effect. So yeah, I just give Stuffed Bear an F. And then Evolving Wilds, I give a C+ almost across the board, because it just gives you a lot of flexibility, helps you splash, helps you fix, helps make sure your mana is more consistent. And so I almost always give Evolving Wilds a C+, just because it makes your deck a little bit better, and that's really valuable for a land. That is going to do it for this draft set review, limited set review, because it also applies to sealed in some way. Sealed is a little bit different. I generally give my evaluations as if it's draft, because most people play draft most of the time. And sealed does have some slight differences, so cards would go up or down a little bit in sealed, but that's going to do it for this limited set review. I do hope you enjoyed it. Remember that if you would like to find my full card-by-card grade spreadsheet, you can find that on the Patreon. It supports my work. It helps me continue making these videos, and it just gives you access to some cool bonus resources. So if you are interested in that, check out the Patreon, patreon.com/NicolaiBolas. If you did enjoy this video, hit that thumbs up button, subscribe for more content, comment below with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. Which cards did you disagree with? Which cards did you agree with? Are there other questions you had about Innistrad Midnight Hunt? And then stay tuned. Subscribe to the channel for more content. I mean, I'm making a bunch of stuff about Midnight Hunt. I've got my draft guide coming out in a few days, which will be a very good resource for you for getting ready for Midnight Hunt as well. And yeah, if you would like to find my articles, the NicolaiBolas Discord server, a great place to talk about all things Magic. You can find links to those in the description down below. You can also, if you have Amazon Prime, you can support my work at no extra cost to yourself. Simply link your Amazon account and your Twitch account. I do have even if you don't watch Twitch, it goes to the same thing. So you can then subscribe to the NicolaiBolas Twitch stream at no extra cost to yourself, because Amazon owns Twitch. That's a really cool way to support my work at no extra cost to yourself. Yeah, the link to the Twitch stream is in the description as well as a link to the merchandise, NicolaiBolas merchandise, if you're interested in that, those sorts of things as well. So a bunch of cool links in the description if you want to check them out, basically. That is going to do it for this limited set review. I'm losing focus. That is going to do it for this limited set review, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.